Good morning to some, good evening to others. Welcome very much to the second lecture of our RECONNECT webinar series on democratic and rule of law backsliding, causes, consequences, and prospects from around the world. In this global webinar series, we take stock of major developments with regard to rule of law and democracy backsliding in specific countries and regions around the globe. Today, we are happy to welcome Professor Rahul Mukherji, who will share insights on recent developments from India in his lecture entitled India's Turn to Authoritarianism. You're all invited to participate and send us questions via the chat box on the GoToWebinar software, and which you can find in your viewing pane on your screen. This global webinar series was developed to look at developments outside Europe on which the RECONNECT project, in which this webinar series is framed, is currently focusing. As some of you might know, RECONNECT is an EU-funded Horizon 2020 project on reconciling Europe with its citizens to democracy and the rule of law. And we bring together 18 universities from 14 countries. Its aim is to understand developments with regard to rule of law in the EU and its member states and explore ways to strengthen European democracy. A primary focus of the project is to understand factors and processes which lead to or sustain democratic and rule of law. Many of these developments we look at RECONNECT also play out in other countries in the world, and that's why we launched the RECONNECT webinar series on developments in other parts of the world. Today we have with us a leading expert from India, Professor Rahul Mukherji. Rahul is professor and head of the Department of Political Science and the South Asia Institute in Heidelberg University, of which he is also the current executive director. He holds his PhD from Columbia University, and he teaches and researches in the areas of South Asian politics, political economy, and international relations. Professor Mukherji serves on the board of many leading journals, and he is the co-editor of a book series entitled Institutions and Development in South Asia, which is published by Oxford University Press. He is the author and editor of several leading publications. More recently, he published on policy paradigms and path dependencies, the endogenous roots of institutional displacements and drift in India, in global public policy and governance, and also published on democracy versus COVID, India's Illiberal Remedy in the Journal of Democracy, which was published in 2020. Promises to become a very interesting lecture, and we have participants from many parts of the world, so all feel free to join in, send us your questions and comments, and then we can feed that into the Q&A afterwards. Professor Mukherji will talk for approximately 20-25 minutes, and then we will open it up for debate. So now it's my great pleasure to give the floor to Professor Mukherji.
Thank you, Dr. Marks, for this very generous introduction. I'm also very pleased to learn about this Global RECONNECT project, because what we are going to discuss today looks like an Indian phenomenon, but from many points of view, it's also a global phenomenon. And it's very, very important to connect the particular countries with the global phenomenon. India, of course, is a very important country. As you know, that the VDEM report recently downgraded the world's largest democracy to what it called an electoral autocracy. So it gives me great pleasure, based on some ongoing research that is taking place in my department, to present some of the recent findings regarding the trajectory of India's democracy. May we now move over to the next slide, please? So as you very well know, the VDEM report has clearly pointed out that India's score has gone down from 0.57 in 2013, which was one of the highest, to 0.23 in 2020, which is the lowest. So how has this happened within a span of just 7 years? I wish to introduce the concept of competitive authoritarianism, which is now very popular in the field. It's a concept that was introduced by Levitsky in the book, The Death of Democracy, How Democracies Die. Competitive authoritarian regimes are not the kinds of regimes that quickly transition to authoritarianism. These are regimes that have fairly intelligent leaders who gradually rig the institutions of democracy in such a way that it becomes easier for incumbents to stay in power. So this is a graduated path to authoritarian propensities. Now, I will argue that there are certain pre-existing conditions that are very, very important for us to understand India's trajectory. The first pre-existing condition is the fact that Hindu nationalism as an idea has been growing in India not since yesterday, but for a very long time. But in the most recent period, from 2014 onwards, there is a right-wing Hindu nationalist party in power. Moreover, in 2019, this party won a thumping majority, and such was the nature of this majority that the next party, which is the Congress party, had only 52 seats in the parliament when the BJP had 303. And these 52 seats did not even allow that party to have a leader in the opposition. You needed 55 to have a leader in the opposition from your party. So we find that in the 2019 elections, building on the trajectory of the 2014 elections, the Congress party was thrashed to smithereens. Not only was it thrashed to smithereens, what was attempted to be thrashed were certain values enshrined in the Indian Constitution, especially in Article 14, which connect to liberty, equality, and fraternity. Now, I will try to show how these pre-existing conditions were actually taken over in 2019 during the pre-pandemic period, after the BJP won for the second time in 2019. Then I will also try to show how some of these conditions were impacted by the pandemic. I will argue that we have to look very carefully at ideas and paths. The idea of competitive authoritarianism based on a Hindu majoritarian view has followed a couple of very different types of paths in the trajectory towards competitive authoritarianism. The first path, which is fairly well known in historical institutionalism, is what they call drift. Drift is a situation where you do not change the rules of the game, you just interpret them differently. Interpreting rules differently actually can produce gradual changes in institutions. So one example of drift is the manner in which the goods and services tax has been implemented in India in the post-COVID situation. In the pre-COVID situation in 2017, the goods and services tax was actually legislated after giving the federal subnational states their due powers. And according to this, it was assessed that once the goods and services tax is to be implemented, a certain generous growth in revenues must be given to all the states for a period of 5 years at the rate of 14%. But when the pandemic came, no rules were changed. the central government, in a very uncharacteristic way, made it very clear that the shortfall that it was unable to pay, which was something to the tune of $13.25 billion, should be borrowed from a special window of the Reserve Bank of India, which will be paid back when it becomes possible. Furthermore, states suffered from COVID-related health expenses, and it was argued that this expenditure of 18.86 billion could be borrowed from the market, and you could borrow up to 3.5 percentage points of the state's GDP from the market without conditions. But beyond that, if you had to borrow, there will be conditions imposed by the center. And for this amount, only the principal will be paid back and not the interest. The question over here is not what the center said. The question over here is the manner in which the center dictated the terms. No rules were changed, interpretations were, and the center, without giving due consultative powers to the subnational states, changed the rules. Now, this is an example of drift. The second pathway is layering. Here, you gradually change the rules. You change the rules in such a way that if there is a hegemonic idea like secularism, like civil society, empowerment, you can't completely overturn that idea, but on top of the old idea, you actually place a norm or an institutional variation that fights the old idea. So the Foreign Contributions Regulation Act of 2020 did just that. It stipulated that all non-governmental organizations in India which depend on foreign funds would now only be able to spend 20% of their foreign funds for administrative expenditure. Many NGOs in India thought that if you go with this stipulation, then a lot of research and advocacy work will get affected. Second, it was legislated that one FCRA approved NGO cannot lend to another FCRA approved NGO. This is a kind of stipulation that creates a scenario where large NGOs who are able to get a lot of funding based on the basis of their proposals often work with smaller NGOs which have much better capacity to deliver on the ground. Such possibilities were removed. The removal of such possibilities would lead to a situation where small NGOs would either become defunct or they would have to become a part of larger NGOs. Now, this is a classic example of layering. Following gradual legal change, there could also be policy changes. The final mode of delivering change is displacement. This is abrupt change. This is something that happened in Kashmir in August of 2019, when Article 370 of the Indian Constitution was abrogated. Article 370 of the Indian Constitution gave Kashmir special powers within the Indian Union because it was the only Muslim majority state. Now, this was not the only state in the Indian Union which had special privileges. States in the Northeast also have special privileges, so that I am an Indian citizen. I could not buy property in Kashmir under the previous law. However, Kashmiris could buy property in mainland India. There were many such special provisions which abruptly came to an end with the abrogation of Article 370, which not only ended the special status, but also converted Jammu and Kashmir into a union territory. It did not convert the state into a normal state. It converted Kashmir into a special region which comes more directly under central rule, which is the definition of a union territory. Now, in the GST case, I can say that the pandemic played a very important role. It was after the pandemic that the government argued that there was this hand of God, And because there was this hand of God, we had to do something extraordinary. And that something extraordinary was to give center unusual powers in determining relationships that require more consultation. In the case of the FCRA of 2020, the pandemic again played a role, because this was a period in the parliament which was opened only for a very short time, and with very little consultation, lots of laws were passed. In the case of the abrogation of Article 370, of course, this happened in 2019 before the pandemic, but there were lots of protests connected with the abrogation of Article 370 and other discriminatory laws, which ended as a result of the pandemic and the curfew that was imposed. The pandemic itself actually led to the imposition of a sudden curfew, about which I can talk much later, without any consultation and with grievous consequences for poor migrant laborers who got stuck in their locations. Maybe move to the next slide now. Now, in this particular slide, I have actually given many cases that I will not have the time to discuss. But what I want you to understand is the relationship between these different modes of change, drift, layering, and displacement, on the change that is being sought. So you can drift towards reducing civil society, and one of the ways in which it was done, for example, was the manner in which media has been curbed. So for example, if you look at the recent VDEM report, you find that censorship has increased. I was told today that the farmers' protests that are taking place in India today are not on the mainstream media, because there is a direction that they should not be covered. You can also have layered approaches to reducing civil society. And in this particular case, I mentioned the FCRA of 2020. I can also talk about the Unlawful Activities Prevention Amendment Bill, which has made it very easy to catch anyone on the basis of not much evidence as being anti-national. Then there is the combination of the Citizenship Amendment Act and the National Register for Citizens, which are interpreted as laws that go against Article 14 of the Indian Constitution. There are many cases in the Supreme Court which the Supreme Court has not yet taken on. And then there is this very, very controversial trust fund, which is called PM Cares. I can talk about this in Q&A and tell you how suddenly it arrived after the pandemic with no parliamentary consultations, and how its opaque nature is deeply problematic. But most importantly, there were the Farm Bills of 2020. These Farm Bills of 2020 have roused the ire of farmers, because farmers believe that these bills will signal the corporate takeover of rural India. And I will talk a little bit later about how these bills have actually created the most democratic moment in the post-Hindu nationalist era, which is the widespread protests of farmers. I have already talked to you about the abrogation of Article 370, which led to the end of the special status for Jammu and Kashmir. This is another way in which not layering, but displacement happened. Because here, the institution was not gradually changed in a certain direction, it was completely displaced. Elections have also been held. And I can talk about the elections in Kashmir in the context of it having become a union territory from a special state. Similarly, drift, layering, and I don't have cases for displacement, strategies could be used to attack the state itself, the pluralist and democratic nature of the state. And in this area, I would take the example of fiscal federalism. Fiscal federalism is the example with which I began. This was about the GST story. how the goods and services tax was actually converted into a situation where the states were not consulted about compensation. I can talk to you about how the Supreme Court in India, without any change in laws or regulations, has come to a much greater extent under the authority of the executive. Then you can have layered attacks on the pluralistic character of the state. And one of these layered attacks on the pluralistic character of the state is the very interesting example of electoral bonds. These electoral bonds, and I can talk a lot about this during the Q&A, are a very special innovation that allows parties to raise much more funding than before in an opaque manner, so that the incumbents are likely to get much more funding to win elections. So for example, in the 2019 elections, I found that that something like 167 million euros was raised through election bonds, of which 61% went to the BJP that won the elections. Other parties obviously got proportionately much less. We can talk. These are all very complicated issues. Finally, I would also like to assert the fact that the story of India's democracy is not entirely over. The farmers have been resisting the farm bills. There have been sometimes up to 300,000 farmers who have gathered themselves in various parts of Delhi, which borders the neighboring states of Uttar Pradesh, Haryana, and Punjab. The movement is very strong. Prime Minister Modi has invited these farmers for discussions. He has even agreed to amend the farm laws. But the farmers are stuck on the fact that amendment will not work. The farm laws have to be repealed because they were legislated in the most undemocratic way. And that is itself an ethnographic story on which I can talk a little bit about. The other resistance, and I'm calling this drift because there have been no changes in laws, it is just that society is responding to these undemocratic propensities, is that in the recent elections, which will take place in May in the state of West Bengal, where the ruling BJP has never won an election, money power is being used to routinely buy legislators from the ruling Trinamool Congress to the BJP. This money power and this change of legislatures from one party to another almost became a kind of an sort of an eyesore when all the regional opposition parties from various states in India came to support the incumbent Trinamool Congress. One former senior leader of the Bharatiya Janata Party, Mr. Yashwant Sinha, joined the Trinamool Congress a few days ago. And one also found that a lot of the farmers who were protesting in Delhi went to West Bengal to connect with farmers and tell them that please don't vote for the BJP, because this will mean that your lands will be taken over by the corporates. So there is some political momentum developing despite the financial muscle of the incumbent. Now the question is, what kind of layering will happen? If the BJP wins in West Bengal in May, of course, it will be a layered strengthening of Hindu nationalist rule under the BJP, which is turning undemocratic. On the other hand, if the Trinamool Congress is able to keep its majority, it's already an opposition party in power in the state, then it will be an addition to various other states like Chhattisgarh, Punjab, Maharashtra, and Delhi that will increase the power of opposition politics. I can see that we are running out of time, so I will quickly conclude now. Can we move over to the last slide? So to conclude, I think if I were coherent and if I had more time, I would argue that where in quadrant 2, where the FCRA was, where there was a layered attack on civil society, I would actually say that this, what you see quadrant 2 is actually quadrant 1. In quadrant 1, where we talked about FCRA and curbing media, the pandemic did not really make much of an impact. In quadrant 2, which reads, I think, quadrant 3 over here, where there was layered attacks on civil society, I think the pre-existing conditions did exist, which were of a competitive authoritarian nature, but the pandemic exacerbated them. In quadrant 3, which is drift towards attacking the pluralistic state in the area of fiscal federalism and in the area of executive control over the Supreme Court, if I had more time, I would argue that the pandemic did impact competitive authoritarian propensities. In the case of electoral bonds, the problem of the incumbent getting more power to win elections, I think the pandemic really didn't matter. The BJP got away with something that it introduced in 2017. In the case of resistance, which is the farmers' movement and the nascent regional opposition to the BJP in West Bengal, there is a lot of widespread open protest despite the pandemic. This is fascinating. The pandemic has not been able to stop people from coming out and protest. And of course, the electoral victories, which way they go, I am not able to ascertain. Either way, the pandemic would not have made an impact. So I think overall, if I was to look at the impact of the pandemic, I would say there is a certain impact of the pandemic, but the pandemic is largely building on pre-existing conditions of competitive authoritarian nature. And it is those pre-existing conditions that are moving, either drifting or layering or displacing old institutions, that are taking India in the direction of a competitive authoritarian regime. However, I will not say that these are the last days of India's democracy, because there are social movements, there is a powerful and restive society, and that society is willing to take a lot of brickbats to ensure that the story of democracy is not completely over. So thank you very much. I think I have taken my 25 minutes, and we can now move on to the Q&A.
Thank you very much for a very fascinating and interesting presentation. And I invite everybody following us today to send in your questions, and we feed into the Q&A. We already have gotten some questions in, and maybe I can start off with questions related maybe to, let's say, some of the underlying causes of the different pathways you described. You very interestingly showed and explained the different pathways through which this turn is happening, either very gradually by interpreting or changing rules, sometimes through displacement more significantly. But the question which arises is, what political factors are driving these dynamics? And would you be able to shed some light on maybe the causes of the rise of the BJP support and its coming into power in 2014, and why it's not happening earlier, or why it was happening then? So maybe you can already have some reflection on that.
So that's a very good question. So you must understand that there is a BJP and there is a BJP. So there was a BJP government in power from 1998 to 2004 under Prime Minister Vajpayee. That government actually did not do many things. It did not touch Kashmir. In fact, Kashmiris feel that the BJP government of 2014, from 1998 to 2004, was very sympathetic to the Muslim majority state of Kashmir. During that period, the Babri Mosque, which has now, it has been said that there's now a temple on top of the mosque, which was demolished illegally, was never touched. So there was a BJP which obviously had some Hindu nationalist propensity, but which was fairly progressive, and that BJP actually is the BJP from where Mr. Yashwant Sinha, as cabinet minister, has now joined the Trinamool Congress. But the BJP that came to power in 2014 was a very different BJP. And that BJP came to power obviously building on the power that the BJP had for the first time from 1998 to 2004. But it came after 10 years of Congress party rule. The Congress party is a left of center party, which implemented some of the most fascinating welfare reforms in India. But by the time it exited, it was completely crowded with scandals. And the other important reason that brought the Congress party down was the lack of leadership. So for example, from 2005 to 2009, Dr. Manmohan Singh was the prime minister, and then he was touted as the next prime minister for the next period until 2013. He was rather a technocrat with the political backing of the Congress party. But thereafter, somehow the Congress party's leader, Mr. Rahul Gandhi, could not emerge as a match for the charismatic icon of the BJP right now, Mr. Narendra Modi. So that is one very big problem, that the Congress party has somehow not been very democratic internally, and it has not been able to project even within itself some of the leadership that exists. And this is a very big problem in the Congress party even today. So for example, one of the reasons why the Congress party is in disarray even after the 2019 elections is because Mr. Rahul Gandhi stepped down as Congress president. And after he stepped down as Congress president, the Congress could not actually appoint a real president. So his mother, Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, has been the interim president of the Congress party since 2019. And there is now a lot of request to democratically resolve this issue. So there are underlying problems within the Congress party, which the Congress party has to solve. But all this is happening in the context of a very well-organized BJP, which has a cadre base through a social organization of 7 to 8 million people called the RSS, which has organized itself on Hindu nationalist principles and has successfully been able to divide the population and the vote to a very great extent between Hindus and Muslims. And I think this is the reason the decline of the Congress party as an organization, the emergence of the BJP in the presence of a weak opposition with a very coherent ideology, which is Hindu nationalist, which is centralizing, and which increasingly looks like a cadre-based party, where the party will control the state. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. There's also a question coming in on some of the examples you gave about the different dynamics, drift, layering, displacement, focusing on activities happening in the media, with farming and so on. There's the question whether it also has any impact on universities and academic freedom, and have universities been affected by these different pathways you identified, and if so, are they in any way resisting and responding to that?
Excellent question. The universities have been trampled, but the way in which the trampling has happened is not that every university has been targeted with the same amount of force. The most important university that has been targeted is the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, which is a premier institution, which was actually known to be a very important institution with a progressive outlook. And what has happened is that in a number of ways, the university has lost its autonomy. A vice chancellor was appointed, who is working directly under the orders of the executive, and he has successfully been able, to the dismay of almost all the faculty, been able to override many of the traditions of that university. It's a university where I studied myself, and has been able to appoint fairly incompetent people who are RSS cadres. In this way, a whole lot of appointments are taking place where your allegiance to the RSS, this nationalist organization, is considered to be of paramount importance. The universities had been a source of resistance. So, for example, when the Citizenship Amendment Act took place, where it was argued that Hindus from Pakistan and Bangladesh can more easily become citizens, also Jains, Sikhs, and Christians, but not Muslims. When it was decided that there will be a national register of citizens, which will decide who is actually a citizen, around this time there was a lot of protest in the universities. And these protests were actually overtaken by violence. And the violence has pointed towards people who belong to a particular organization, and they were never nabbed by the police. So, for example, in Jamia Millia Islamia, which is a premier institution in New Delhi, there was such violence provoked from outside, also at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. And when the students actually behaved very responsibly, most recently, this lady, Safur Zagar, who was released despite the UAPA because she was pregnant, the United Nations has just ruled that her detention was against the covenant. And since this is on March 11th, the United Nations, whatever, working group has ruled, and that since she was detained under UAPA illegally, and because India is a signatory to that covenant, serious investigation should be done. The person who was behind bars should be compensated, and the executive that misbehaved should be. Now, this is what the United Nations is saying. Of course, there are many other detentions under the UAPA, which was also in my slide, which makes it much easier. And many of these UAPA people are actually students. And many of them are actually harmless students who have been taken in because of this very draconian law. I can also give you the example of one of India's leading human rights activists, Mr. Harsh Bandar. Mr. Harsh Bandar was a former civil servant, an Indian Administrative Services officer, who resigned and became a human rights activist. When these problems were taking place in Jamia, he delivered a public lecture. In that public lecture, he said that Muslims of India had the choice to go to Pakistan. But those Muslims who stayed in India because they thought it was their own country. Hindus did not have that option. At the time of partition, India was divided into India and Pakistan. Pakistan was supposed to be for the Muslims. And India still has more Muslims in Bangladesh, probably the same number as Pakistan. What that means is that a lot of Muslims thought that despite the partition, India is their country. And that is the spirit in which Article 14 of the Indian Constitution talks about liberty, equality, and fraternity. And subsequently, the term secular was added to the Indian Constitution in 1976. So Mr. Mandar was arguing that, you are as much a part of the country as are the Hindus, because you had the choice. Now, he was giving a very peaceful lecture. He was actually drawing on Gandhi. He's a Gandhian. He has been charge sheeted. And it's not just Harsh Mandar. There are lots of very eminent civil rights activists and lawyers who are in prison. Even university professors like Jayati Ghosh, the retired JNU professor of economics, So university campuses have been attacked, as they have been in many other competitive authoritarian regimes.
Thank you. Maybe very quickly, we get a lot of questions in, but a very quick definitional question we are receiving. How would you define competitive authoritarianism as distinguished from other forms of authoritarianism, like populist and so on? What is the distinguishing feature between these different types?
You see, competitive authoritarianism obviously could rely on populist basis. I mean, there's now research comparing India, Turkey, and I think even Netanyahu's Israel, where there is sort of comparison on the nature of populism in these countries. And obviously, in the Indian case, it will be populism that would make a certain population more happy, and in this particular case, populism confined to certain benefits that targeted groups feel, especially Hindus feel, would be of benefit. But what is interesting in this analysis, which distinguishes, I think, competitive authoritarianism from just populism, is the fact that either dictators or emerging dictators are people who have become very smart. They will not make the mistake that Soviet Union did, as Mr. Putin is not. They are gradually, so for example, the Election Commission of India has not become a defunct body, but it is much more difficult for the Election Commission to take position. Despite the Election Commission, you have the electoral bonds, which I can discuss in detail. The Supreme Court is somewhat more compromised, but it does not mean that all the judges of the Supreme Court are not free. And the free judges of the Supreme Court can. But what happens is that if the Chief Justice is under your command, then he sets the roster, and it becomes very difficult. There are still lots of judges in the high courts who are giving excellent judgments. For example, Amnesty International got some very good judgments from the Karnataka High Court, even when the state was ruled by the BJP. So this idea of competitive authoritarianism suggests that it is a kind of a gradual process where it increasingly becomes more difficult for opposition parties to beat the incumbent. But the story is not yet over. So for example, I can tell you that in the state of Chhattisgarh in 2018, the Congress party won elections. In Maharashtra, which is India's richest state, it's a combination of Shiv Sena, the Nationalist Congress Party, and the Congress Party, which are ruling the state. Now, it's not that the opposition has the majority of the states, but elections are going in favor of opposition parties. I would not be surprised if the West Bengal election goes in favor of the Trinamool Congress, which is competing with the BJP. Now, even though such victories are taking place, it does not mean that it is equally easy for the opposition parties to win. And so if you take up various ways, so for example, let's look at the electoral bonds. Now, electoral bonds are for everybody, because now rich people or corporates can buy bonds of various denominations, but their names will be anonymous. What this does is that you can now put in much more money legally into a party without anybody else coming to know about it. Now, on the face of it, it is available for everybody. But we know that more than 60% of the electoral bonds in the 2019 elections went to the BJP. We don't know who gave whom. I mean, since time is running out, I can give more examples. For example, PM Cares was there. But the whole idea is to change the regulatory setup in a way that it makes it easier and easier and easier for. So, for example, curbs on media. There are no laws that have changed. The media has not become completely subservient. Farmers' protests have been, but the farmers' protests that are taking place today cannot be shown, are not being shown. So it's a graduated movement in the direction of making things different. And that actually helps a party in power to look both democratic as well as turn authoritarian. I think that would be a way to understand the difference between populism, which has more to do with targeted benefits to targeted populations, as opposed to a strategy of changing rules gradually, impacting the electoral process. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Still have a lot of questions. Maybe if you allow me one final brief question, because we're getting a few questions in on how the dynamics you describe feed into the external policies, external foreign relation policies of India, and whether the emergence of a new administration in the US, the Biden administration, will have had any effect on the internal dynamics in India. You have any reflections on that?
Well, the Biden administration, I do not think has so far had an impact, but from my own connections with the United States and people who would be advising the Biden administration, and from the kinds of remarks made by people like Zakaria, it is very clear that the Biden administration would like India to truly become a part of the Committee of Liberal Nations. So there is a kind of a contradiction. And I think the Biden administration's strategy would be to shame India to a situation where, because of its own professed commitment to liberalism and democracy, and because also it wants to distance itself from China, to be able to boldly show that India is not moving in the direction of a one-party state, right? However, to what extent that will be successful, I am not yet sure, because the recent negotiations with respect to the Quad seem to have gone very well. India is going to be exporting vaccines to even the United States, and all the VDEM and the Freedom House report kinds of things that are happening are being attributed to a kind of Western hegemonic discourse that the ruling party does not want to take seriously. In fact, Foreign Minister Dr. Jaishankar has openly said that, look, I mean, why should we care? We are a democracy. We have free media. I mean, who will say that India is quiet? And to some extent, that is true. I mean, the farmers are still there. But of course, it is not true, because the media is far more controlled. The Election Commission is under pressure. The Supreme Court is not working normally. Lots of people under UAPA are in prison. Kashmir has been overnight turned from a special state to a union territory. So I don't know whether I'm really competent to answer this question, but from what I know, I think the Biden administration would have a clear commitment to deal with this. But dealing with India is not going to be easy, because India is a very big country with a large armed forces, and the Quad will have to do all those exercises in the South China Sea. India has a very smart foreign minister in Dr. Jaishankar, extremely smart diplomat. So I am not sure what will be the result of these two propensities. India's very smart ability to garner its importance in the region to oppose such propensities, and clearly I think the Biden administration's desire that India becomes more like a democracy. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, our time is up. We still have a lot of questions. I will send the questions to you, and then you can still see if you want to pick up some of them in a bilateral discussion with people. We want to thank you very much for your very engaging and interesting lecture, and also for your insights on the different questions you got. So thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you all for attending and feeding into the discussion and all your great questions we received. We will continue our series next month, when we will have on the 27th of April, also at 4 p.m., Professor Nicholas Cheeseman from the University of Birmingham, who will focus on current trends and developments with regard to democracy in Africa. You can register soon via our website, RECONNECT europe.eu. And we hope to see you then again and join us in the debates. Thank you very much to you all for attending. Thank you very much, Professor Mukherji, for your talk, and we hope we can stay in touch. Bye to everybody.
I very much enjoyed the interaction, and all the very best for your project.
Thank you very much.